August 23, 1942. The west bank of the Volga River. The air smelled of dust and burning oil as the first German bombers appeared over Stalingrad. They came in waves, hundreds of Junkers and Heinkels, their engines droning like metal thunder across the summer sky. Below them, a city of 500,000 people went about their morning routines, unaware that within hours their world would cease to exist. The bombs fell in cascading columns, tearing through apartment blocks, factories, and streets with methodical precision. Firestorms erupted across the city center. Glass shattered in waves. Wooden structures ignited like matchsticks. By nightfall, smoke rose so thick it blotted out the stars. The Luftwaffe had delivered 600 tons of explosives in a single afternoon. Stalingrad, named for the Soviet dictator himself, was burning. For the Wehrmacht soldiers watching from the steppe beyond, the sight inspired a grim confidence. This was the pattern they had come to expect. Overwhelming air power. Rapid armor advances. Swift capitulation. Since 1939, the German war machine had rolled across Poland, France, the Balkans, and deep into the Soviet Union with a speed that defied comprehension. City after city had fallen. Why would Stalingrad be different? Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a 22-year-old machine gunner from Bavaria, stood beside his MG-42 position and watched the smoke columns rise. He had been fighting since the invasion of France. He had crossed the Bug River in June 1941. He had survived the winter outside Moscow when temperatures fell to -40 and men froze solid in their foxholes. Now, 2 summers into the Russian campaign, he believed the worst was behind him. "They cannot hold us forever," he told his squad mate, a farmer's son from Silesia. "Look at that city. It is already dead." The farmer nodded, lighting a cigarette with hands blackened by gunpowder residue. Around them, other soldiers cleaned weapons, checked ammunition belts, and spoke in low voices about the final push. The officers had told them Stalingrad was the last obstacle before the Caucasus oil fields. Capture the city, secure the river, cut off Soviet supply routes. Then the war in the east would be over. They did not yet understand that Stalingrad would not fall like other cities. That within its ruined streets, the rules of warfare would dissolve into something older and more primal. That the city would become a grinder, consuming entire divisions, erasing distinctions between victor and vanquished, until nothing remained but exhaustion, hunger, and the quiet recognition that the enemy across the rubble was suffering the same hell. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Paulus, was one of the most formidable formations in military history. Over 250,000 men. Tank divisions. Artillery battalions. Air support. It had crushed Soviet resistance across Ukraine, seized Kharkov, and driven eastward through the summer heat with momentum that seemed unstoppable. Paulus himself was a staff officer by training, methodical and cautious, chosen by Hitler to execute what Berlin called the decisive campaign of 1942. The strategic logic was clear. Stalingrad controlled the Volga River, the lifeline connecting central Russia to the Caucasus. Capturing the city would sever Soviet communications, deny Stalin his oil supplies, and demoralize the Red Army. More than that, it would deliver a psychological blow. A city bearing Stalin's name falling to German forces would resonate across the world. Hitler wanted Stalingrad not just occupied but obliterated. On the Soviet side, the defense was desperate and improvised. General Vasily Chukov, appointed to command the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, arrived in the city in mid-September. He was 42 years old, tough, profane, and utterly uninterested in strategy that did not involve killing Germans at close range. His orders from Stalin were succinct: hold the city at any cost. Chukov understood immediately that conventional defense would fail. The Germans had superior firepower, better logistics, and control of the air. The city was already half destroyed. Most of the civilian population had either fled or perished in the bombing. What remained was rubble, ruins, and Soviet soldiers arriving in disorganized waves across the Volga under German fire. To survive, Chukov realized, his forces would have to make the city itself a weapon. The Germans like big movements and open ground, he told his staff officers. Give them houses. Give them rooms. Make them fight for every staircase, every cellar, every pile of bricks. Get so close they cannot use their artillery without killing themselves. It was a doctrine born of desperation, but it worked. The 62nd Army dug into the ruins, turning factories into fortresses, apartment blocks into strongpoints. They would not retreat. They could not retreat. Behind them was the Volga, and beyond that, nothing but Siberia. By late September, the German Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad's outskirts. They expected to seize the city within days. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of urban combat where every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress, and every advance measured in meters rather than kilometers. The soldiers who entered Stalingrad that autumn believed they were fighting a battle. They did not yet realize they were descending into an abyss from which many would never return. And somewhere in that abyss, amid the smoke and the ruin and the relentless killing, 2 men on opposite sides would find themselves sharing a cigarette in the rubble, discovering in that fleeting moment a humanity that war had tried to erase. September 14, 1942. The Central Railway Station. The building had changed hands 4 times in 3 days. German infantry pushed through smoke-filled corridors while Soviet defenders fired from behind upturned desks and shattered walls. Grenades exploded in stairwells. Machine gun fire echoed through the halls. Bodies lay where they fell, uncollected because moving meant dying. Obergefreiter Schmidt crouched behind a concrete pillar, his MG-42 barrel glowing red from sustained fire. Across the platform he could see Soviet soldiers darting between columns, their movements quick and desperate. He squeezed the trigger in controlled bursts, watching tracers arc through the smoke. The noise was deafening. The air tasted of cordite and brick dust. His ears rang so badly he could barely hear his squad leader shouting orders. The Germans took the station by midday. By evening, Soviet counterattacks had driven them back. By dawn, German assault groups reclaimed half the building. This was the new pattern. No clear front lines. No secure positions. Just an endless churn of attack and counterattack, advance and retreat, with the ground beneath littered with the debris of previous battles. Schmidt began to understand that Stalingrad was not a city to be conquered. It was a place where armies came to bleed. The urban landscape itself had become hostile. Streets were impassable canyons of rubble. Buildings collapsed without warning, burying entire squads. Snipers operated from positions that changed hourly. Artillery fire turned intersections into killing zones. The Germans, trained for mobile warfare on open ground, found themselves fighting in close quarters where tanks were useless and radios failed amid the maze of ruins. Every meter gained cost lives. Lieutenant Mikhail Panikhin, a 26-year-old platoon commander from Leningrad, led his men through the sewers beneath the city. They moved in silence, wading through water mixed with oil and blood, their rifles held above their heads. Above them, German patrols searched the ruins. Down here in the darkness, they could move unseen, emerging behind enemy lines to launch raids before vanishing back into the tunnels. Panikhin had been a schoolteacher before the war. He taught literature to teenagers who now lay dead in fields from Moscow to Minsk. He had joined the Red Army in 1941, survived the German advance, and been promoted after most of his officers were killed. Now he commanded 30 men, all that remained of a company that had crossed the Volga with 140 soldiers 3 weeks earlier. He no longer thought about teaching. He thought only about survival, about killing Germans, and about ensuring his men lasted another day. The Soviet strategy of hugging the enemy close proved devastatingly effective. German artillery, the Wehrmacht's most powerful weapon, became a liability in Stalingrad. Firing on Soviet positions often meant hitting German troops positioned meters away. Air support was useless against targets buried in cellars or hiding in rubble. The Luftwaffe bombed indiscriminately, sometimes striking their own forces. The tactical advantages the Germans had relied upon across Europe evaporated in the ruins. Instead, the battle devolved into grenades thrown through doorways, bayonet charges up staircases, room-to-room combat with knives and entrenching tools. Men fought in the dark, identifying enemies by sound, by silhouette, by instinct. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers went days without sleep, existing in a perpetual state of alertness where any shadow might conceal death. Nerves frayed. Discipline eroded. Men began to see ghosts in the rubble. Schmidt's squad occupied the 3rd floor of what had once been an apartment building. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The floor was covered in plaster dust and spent shell casings. Through a shattered window, he could see the Volga River in the distance, its surface reflecting the fires burning across the city. Soviet soldiers occupied the floor below. They could hear each other moving, coughing, loading weapons. Sometimes they shouted insults through the floorboards. Neither side could dislodge the other. At night, the city became a different hell. Darkness amplified every sound. The crack of a rifle shot. The crunch of boots on glass. The rattle of debris falling from damaged buildings. Both sides sent out patrols, small groups of men creeping through the ruins, hunting each other in the blackness. Sometimes they collided in sudden, brutal firefights. More often they passed within meters of each other, unaware, held frozen by mutual terror. Hunger became a constant companion. The German supply lines, stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile steppe, could not deliver enough food for the troops engaged in Stalingrad. Rations were reduced, then reduced again. Schmidt's squad lived on hardtack biscuits, ersatz coffee made from acorns, and occasional tins of meat that tasted like grease and despair. They scavenged from the dead, German and Soviet alike, searching pockets for bread or chocolate or anything edible. The Soviets were starving too. Panikhin's men subsisted on whatever crossed the Volga with them, ammunition barges that sometimes carried sacks of dried peas or buckwheat groats. They boiled water from shell craters, mixing it with flour to make paste they ate cold. One soldier shot a stray dog and the platoon divided it raw, too afraid to light fires that would draw German attention. They did not speak of hunger. Speaking made it worse. They simply endured, their bodies consuming themselves, their strength fading with each passing day. By October, both armies had been ground down into something unrecognizable. The German Sixth Army, once a proud mechanized force, had been reduced to infantry clinging to ruins. The Soviet 62nd Army, reinforced nightly with fresh troops ferried across the Volga, fed men into the battle faster than they could die, maintaining a presence that defied annihilation. Neither side could win. Neither side could retreat. They could only continue, locked together in a death embrace that consumed everything it touched. October 15, 1942. The Barrikady factory district. The fighting here had reached a new level of intensity. This was no longer a battle for streets or buildings. It was a contest for individual rooms, for segments of wall, for piles of rubble that offered a few meters of cover. The Germans pushed forward meter by meter, dynamiting walls, clearing rooms with grenades and automatic fire. The Soviets counterattacked immediately, retaking positions before the dust settled. Schmidt's hands shook as he loaded another ammunition belt into his machine gun. He had not slept in 3 days. His uniform hung loose on his frame, his body shedding weight it could not spare. Around him, his squad mates looked like walking corpses, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. The Bavarian farmer who had shared cigarettes in August had been killed by a mortar strike 2 weeks earlier. Schmidt could no longer remember his name. They occupied a section of factory floor, sheltered behind overturned machinery and concrete pillars. Across the hall, perhaps 20 meters away, Soviet troops held similar positions. The two sides fired at each other constantly, the noise echoing through the cavernous space like thunder trapped in a bottle. When the shooting paused, they could hear each other breathing, coughing, cursing. It was intimate and terrible, this proximity to the enemy. The Germans had developed new tactics for clearing buildings. Assault groups of 8 to 10 men, armed with submachine guns, grenades and satchel charges, would storm a position in coordinated waves. The first wave threw grenades. The second followed immediately with automatic fire. The third secured the position while the fourth moved to the next objective. It was brutal, efficient and costly. Casualties ran at 50% or higher. Few assault group members survived more than a week. Panikhin watched from his position in the factory's basement as German soldiers appeared at the top of a stairwell. He waited until they descended halfway, then triggered the mine his men had rigged to the railing. The explosion tore through the confined space, collapsing part of the staircase and sending the assault group tumbling into the darkness. Soviet soldiers rushed forward with bayonets, finishing the survivors before they could recover. It was not heroism. It was survival. The factory district held a special horror. The industrial machinery, the pipes and ducts and metal frameworks, turned the area into a three-dimensional maze where combat occurred on multiple levels simultaneously. Germans held the ground floor. Soviets controlled the basement. A different squad occupied the catwalks overhead. They fought vertically, firing down through grates, tossing grenades through ventilation shafts, hearing screams echo from directions they could not identify. Night brought no respite. If anything, the darkness intensified the terror. Patrols moved through the ruins by feel, navigating by memory of terrain they had studied during daylight. They encountered each other suddenly at point-blank range, and the firefights that erupted were brief, chaotic, and lethal. Men shot at shadows. They killed their own comrades by mistake. They stumbled over bodies in the dark and could not tell friend from enemy until they touched the corpse's uniform. The wounded presented an impossible dilemma. Evacuating casualties meant exposing stretcher bearers to constant fire. The journey back to German aid stations covered hundreds of meters of open ground. Many wounded died en route. Others lay in shell holes for hours or days, calling for help that never came. Soviet casualties faced the same ordeal, with the added difficulty of crossing the Volga under fire. Medical supplies on both sides dwindled to nothing. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Infections ran rampant. Schmidt's squad leader, a veteran sergeant from Prussia, was hit by a sniper while moving between positions. The bullet entered his chest, puncturing a lung. He lay gasping in the rubble, blood frothing at his lips, while his men crouched helplessly nearby. They could not reach him. The Soviet sniper, positioned somewhere in the ruins across the street, waited for anyone who moved. The sergeant died slowly, his breathing growing shallower, his body convulsing. It took 40 minutes. They listened to every moment. The psychological breaking point arrived differently for each man. Some snapped during combat, their minds rejecting the horror and leaving them catatonic. Others broke quietly, withdrawing into themselves, performing their duties with mechanical precision while something essential inside them died. Schmidt noticed he no longer felt fear. He no longer felt anything. He loaded his weapon, fired, reloaded, slept when ordered, ate when food appeared. He had become an automaton running on fumes and instinct. Panikhin saw the same transformation in his men. They stopped talking. They stopped complaining. They stopped reacting to death. When a comrade was killed, they took his ammunition and moved on. When reinforcements arrived, young soldiers fresh from Siberia with clean uniforms and frightened eyes, the veterans did not bother learning their names. Most would be dead within days. There was no point in forming attachments. Attachment was a luxury the ruins did not permit. By late October, the German advance had stalled completely. They held perhaps 90% of Stalingrad, but the remaining 10%, the narrow strip along the Volga, remained Soviet. Every attempt to push the Red Army into the river failed. The Soviets counterattacked immediately, reclaiming positions, maintaining a presence that refused to be eliminated. The fighting had reached a stalemate, neither side able to advance, both sides unable to retreat. They were locked in position, bleeding each other white. And still the killing continued, day after day, week after week, with no end visible, no hope of resolution, only the grinding certainty that the man beside you today would likely be dead tomorrow, and the enemy across the rubble was experiencing the same inevitable descent into oblivion. November 2, 1942. The Red October factory. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The first snow fell in thin, dirty flakes that melted into the blood-soaked earth. Schmidt wrapped a scavenged Soviet greatcoat around his shoulders, not caring that it marked him as a potential target. His German uniform provided no warmth. His boots, worn through at the soles, let in water that froze against his skin. Frostbite had claimed 2 of his toes. He barely noticed. The factory had become a fortress within a fortress. Its massive structures, concrete walls 3 meters thick, blast furnaces large enough to hide platoons, and endless corridors created a labyrinth where the battle fragmented into hundreds of isolated firefights. Companies became squads. Squads became pairs. Men fought alone, separated from their units, unsure who controlled the next room or the floor above. Communication broke down. Orders became irrelevant. Survival was personal. Panikhin led his remaining 14 men through a ventilation duct, crawling single file through darkness so complete they navigated by touch. The metal walls amplified every sound, making silence impossible. They emerged in a machine shop the Germans believed secure, dropping from ceiling vents with knives and grenades. The attack lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 12 Germans lay dead and Panikhin's force had retreated back into the ducts before reinforcements arrived. This was the new warfare, raids and ambushes, sudden violence erupting from unexpected angles. The Germans fortified their positions, but no position was truly secure. The Soviets moved through the factory's infrastructure, the pipes and sewers and ducts, attacking from below, from above, from behind. They appeared like ghosts, killed and vanished. The Germans began sleeping in shifts, weapons in hand, knowing that any moment might bring Soviet bayonets out of the darkness. The cold became as deadly as combat. November temperatures in Stalingrad dropped to -10, -20, -30 degrees Celsius. Neither army had adequate winter clothing. German soldiers, still wearing the summer uniforms they had invaded with, froze in their positions. Soviet troops fared marginally better, their quilted jackets providing some insulation but not enough. Both sides burned whatever they could find, furniture, books, sometimes corpses, just to generate heat for a few hours. Frostbite and hypothermia killed hundreds. Men fell asleep on watch and never woke. Others lost fingers and toes to the cold, the flesh turning black and dead. Medical officers performed amputations with carpenter's saws, without anesthesia, without proper tools. The screams echoed through the ruins. Those who survived were evacuated, replaced by new soldiers who arrived and began freezing immediately. The cold was democratic. It killed Germans and Soviets with equal efficiency. Food became an obsession. Schmidt's rations had been reduced to 200 grams of bread per day, sometimes supplemented with watery soup made from bones and sawdust. It was not enough. His body consumed itself, burning muscle for energy, leaving him weak and shaking. He dreamed of food constantly, vivid hallucinations of meals from his childhood, sausages and potatoes and fresh bread that vanished when he tried to touch them. The Soviets were starving too. Supply barges crossing the Volga carried ammunition as priority. Food came second. Panikhin distributed what little they had equally, but equality meant everyone went hungry. They ate anything: rats caught in the rubble, leather from boots boiled until soft, paste made from wall plaster mixed with melted snow. Hunger gnawed at thought itself, reducing the world to a single question: when would the next meal arrive? Psychological collapse became epidemic. Men heard voices in the ruins, conversations from empty rooms, the sound of loved ones calling their names. Some became convinced they were already dead, that Stalingrad was hell and they would fight here for eternity. Others simply stopped, sitting down in the rubble and refusing to move, staring at nothing until they died from exposure or enemy fire. The line between sanity and madness blurred. Schmidt witnessed a young soldier from his company walk deliberately into Soviet fire, arms raised, seeking death as release. The machine guns cut him down in seconds. No one tried to stop him. They understood. The weight of Stalingrad pressed on every mind, crushing hope, eroding will, leaving only exhaustion so profound that death began to seem preferable to another hour in the ruins. The city was devouring them from the inside out. For Panikhin, the breaking point came differently. He watched his men die one by one, their bodies left where they fell because retrieving them meant more deaths. He memorized their faces, their names, promising himself he would remember when the war ended. But the names began to blur together. The faces became interchangeable. He realized with horror that he could no longer recall what his best friend had looked like. The war was erasing memory itself, leaving only the present moment of survival. The noise never stopped. Even when guns fell silent, the city groaned around them. Buildings collapsed with slow, grinding crashes. Metal twisted and screamed. The ice on the Volga cracked like artillery fire. Wind howled through the ruins, carrying the smell of death and smoke and chemicals from burning factories. There was no quiet place. No sanctuary. The ruins themselves seemed alive, malevolent, determined to drive every inhabitant insane. November 11th marked a peculiar anniversary. 100 days since the German Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad. Officers noted it in daily reports, a bureaucratic observation of the impossible. 100 days of continuous combat. 10 weeks without rest. 70 nights without proper sleep. The numbers were abstract, meaningless against the reality of existence in the ruins. Time had lost meaning. There was only before Stalingrad and the eternal now of suffering within it. Yet amid the horror, small acts of humanity persisted. A German medic treating a wounded Soviet prisoner, sharing his water. Soviet soldiers leaving bread for German dead, a gesture of respect between those who understood. These moments were rare, fleeting, often hidden from comrades who would see them as weakness. But they occurred, proof that something human remained buried beneath the layers of violence and hate and despair. Schmidt had stopped hating the enemy. Hate required energy he no longer possessed. Instead, he felt a strange kinship with the Soviet soldiers fighting in the same ruins, enduring the same cold, the same hunger, the same slow disintegration of everything that made life worth living. They were not enemies. They were fellow victims of something larger and more terrible than either army could comprehend. The war had become its own entity, consuming everyone equally. This was the inferno. Not the fire of hell, but the grinding, endless, frozen hell of Stalingrad in November 1942, where armies came to die slowly, where men discovered that suffering had no bottom, and where the only certainty was that tomorrow would be worse than today. November 19, 1942. 7:30 hours. The steppe northwest of Stalingrad. The morning was dark, the temperature -15 degrees Celsius. Soviet artillery opened fire along a 250-kilometer front, thousands of guns firing simultaneously in a barrage that shook the frozen earth. The shells fell on Romanian positions flanking the German Sixth Army, tearing through defensive lines manned by soldiers who had been promised this was a quiet sector. In Stalingrad, Schmidt heard the distant thunder and did not understand what it meant. Artillery bombardments were constant background noise. This seemed no different. He crouched in his position, cleaning his weapon, thinking about the bread ration that might arrive that afternoon. He did not know that 300 kilometers away Soviet tank armies were breaking through weakened flanks, beginning a massive encirclement that would trap his entire army. Operation Uranus, planned in absolute secrecy by Soviet High Command, was a double envelopment on a scale unprecedented in military history. Two massive Soviet forces, the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts, would drive toward each other from north and south, meeting far behind German lines to complete the encirclement. The Germans had anticipated a defensive battle around Stalingrad. They had not prepared for a strategic counteroffensive hundreds of kilometers deep. The Romanian Third Army, holding the German northern flank, collapsed within hours. Their equipment was obsolete, their positions thinly manned, their morale destroyed by months watching the German army bleed in Stalingrad. Soviet T-34 tanks drove through their lines, followed by cavalry and mobile infantry. By midday, the Romanians were fleeing westward in panic, abandoning their weapons, their wounded, everything in a desperate attempt to escape the Soviet advance. General Paulus, in his headquarters at Gumrak, received the first reports with disbelief. A breakthrough was possible, even expected. But the scale of the Soviet attack, the speed of the advance, the size of the forces involved, all suggested something more than a local counteroffensive. His staff officers spread maps across tables, plotting Soviet positions, calculating advance rates. By evening, the truth became unavoidable. The Sixth Army was being cut off. November 22 brought confirmation. Soviet forces from north and south met at Kalach, a small town on the Don River 70 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, 250,000 men, was trapped inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. They held Stalingrad, but now Stalingrad held them. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Most German soldiers in Stalingrad did not immediately understand what had happened. They knew Soviet forces had attacked the flanks. They knew retreats were occurring. But the idea that the entire army was surrounded seemed impossible. Schmidt learned of the encirclement from his lieutenant 3 days later, the news delivered in flat, emotionless tones that tried to mask the disaster. "We are temporarily cut off. Relief forces are forming. We hold our positions. Panikhin heard the same news from the opposite perspective. Soviet commanders informed their troops that the German Sixth Army was trapped, that no relief was possible, that victory was imminent. The announcement was met with exhaustion rather than celebration. The men fighting in Stalingrad's ruins were too broken to care about strategic triumphs. They simply wanted the killing to stop. Whether the Germans were encircled or not, bullets still flew and people still died. Hitler's response to the encirclement sealed the Sixth Army's fate. Presented with options, retreat while routes remained open, or hold position and wait for relief, he chose the latter. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad, he ordered. No retreat. Supply will be maintained by air. Field Marshal von Manstein will break the encirclement. It was fantasy disguised as strategy, a refusal to acknowledge reality that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the surrounded army. It was a logistical impossibility. The distance from German airfields to Stalingrad exceeded transport aircraft range. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns controlled the air approaches. Winter weather grounded planes for days at a time. On good days the Luftwaffe delivered 100 tons. On most days far less. The Sixth Army needed 800 tons daily just to survive. The math was simple and deadly. As December began, the pocket's perimeter contracted under Soviet pressure. German units abandoned outlying positions, withdrawing towards Stalingrad center. The ring tightened. Supplies dwindled. The ration was reduced to 100 grams of bread per day, barely enough to sustain life. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Then the horses ran out. Men ate what they could find, which was increasingly nothing. Starvation joined cold and combat as a killer. Inside Stalingrad's ruins, the tactical situation changed little. The fighting continued with the same intensity, the same close-range brutality, but now both sides understood the larger context. The Germans fought knowing they were surrounded, that relief was unlikely, that they were probably going to die. The Soviets attacked knowing that time favored them, that the Germans grew weaker daily, that victory was inevitable if they could simply endure a little longer. The battle became a siege within a siege. And in this darkest moment, as hope died and winter closed its grip, the two men who would share a cigarette in the rubble had not yet met. They fought in the same ruins, breathed the same frozen air, suffered the same slow disintegration of body and spirit. They were enemies separated by ideology, by uniform, by the accident of birth. But they were also fellow prisoners of Stalingrad, bound together by suffering more profound than anything that divided them. December 16, 1942. The German pocket. Temperature -25 degrees. Schmidt's company, which had numbered 140 men in September, now counted 18 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, evacuated, or missing. They occupied a bunker made from rubble and frozen earth, sealed against the wind but offering no warmth. Ice coated the interior walls. Their breath froze in clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. Starvation had transformed them into something inhuman. Skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Eyes sank deep into skulls. Movements became slow, mechanical, conserving energy that no longer existed. Schmidt's uniform hung on him like cloth draped over a skeleton. He could no longer remember what being warm felt like, what being full felt like. Those sensations belonged to a previous life, to someone who had died somewhere back in time. The daily ration, when it came, consisted of a slice of bread the size of a playing card and thin soup made from melted snow and whatever scraps the cooks could find. Sometimes the soup contained horse meat. More often it was just water with salt. Men ate it slowly, forcing themselves to savor each spoonful, pretending it was a meal. Their bodies consumed themselves, burning muscle and organ tissue, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve life for another day. Disease spread through the pocket like wildfire. Dysentery from contaminated water. Typhus from lice that infested every uniform. Pneumonia from cold and malnutrition. Medical supplies had run out weeks earlier. Doctors operated without anesthesia, cutting away frostbitten flesh with whatever tools they possessed. The wounded lay in unheated cellars, their moans a constant background chorus. Most died not from their injuries but from infection and cold. Christmas 1942 arrived with savage irony. German radio broadcast messages from home, families sending greetings to soldiers in Stalingrad. Schmidt listened to a crackling transmission, a woman's voice reading names of men she hoped could hear her. Some of the names were soldiers he had known, men who now lay dead in the ruins. The broadcast felt obscene, a reminder of a world that no longer existed, that perhaps had never existed. He turned the radio off. The Luftwaffe supply drops became increasingly desperate. Transport planes flew at night, navigating by dead reckoning, dropping containers without landing. Many missed the pocket entirely, their supplies falling into Soviet-held territory. Others were shot down, their crews perishing in the frozen steppe. The containers that did arrive often held the wrong supplies, ammunition when food was needed, propaganda leaflets instead of medicine. Each drop was fought over, men scrambling through snow to claim whatever had fallen from the sky. Panikhin watched the German collapse with mixed emotions. The enemy was starving, freezing, dying, which meant Soviet victory was assured. Yet there was no satisfaction in watching men disintegrate from hunger and cold. He had seen too much death, absorbed too much suffering to take pleasure in anyone's demise. The Germans were enemies, yes, but they were also human beings enduring the same hell. The distinction had become blurred. Soviet forces tightened the noose methodically. They did not need to storm German positions. They simply waited, letting winter and starvation do their work. Occasional attacks kept pressure constant, preventing the Germans from organizing, but the real killer was time. Each day the pocket shrank. Each week the German perimeter contracted. Soviet intelligence tracked the Sixth Army's dissolution through intercepted radio messages that grew increasingly desperate. Inside the pocket, discipline began to break down. Soldiers no longer obeyed orders that seemed suicidal. Officers who insisted on senseless attacks were sometimes shot by their own men. Desertions increased, soldiers attempting to slip through Soviet lines under cover of darkness. Most were caught and killed. A few, perhaps, made it to Soviet positions and surrendered. The Wehrmacht, the most disciplined army in the world, was fracturing under pressure it could no longer withstand. Schmidt's bunker received an order to attack a Soviet position 300 meters away. The lieutenant who delivered the order looked apologetic. "I know," he said quietly. "But these are our instructions." No one moved. The soldiers looked at each other, then at the lieutenant. Finally, the oldest man present, a sergeant from Hamburg, spoke. "We will go. But not today. Today we rest." The lieutenant nodded and left. The attack never occurred. January 1943 began with temperatures falling below -30. The cold reached a level where exposed skin froze in seconds, where metal burned like fire, where breath crystallized and fell as ice. Men died simply from existing, their bodies unable to generate heat, their systems shutting down one by one. They died in their sleep. They died standing up. They died while walking, their bodies continuing forward several steps before collapsing into the snow. The German Sixth Army, the force that had conquered half of Europe, had been reduced to 80,000 starving, frozen men clinging to ruins they no longer had the strength to defend. Relief attempts had failed. Supply flights had dwindled to nothing. The Soviet ring was impenetrable. Everyone inside the pocket knew how this would end. They simply did not know when or how many more would die before the final collapse. And it was in this moment, when all hope was gone, when survival itself seemed impossible, that two men would meet in circumstances that defied the logic of war and hatred. January 17, 1943. A collapsed apartment building in the factory district. The temperature was -28 degrees. Snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to a few meters. Schmidt, separated from his unit during a Soviet attack, had taken shelter in what remained of a basement. He was alone. His ammunition was exhausted. He had not eaten in 3 days. Death was no longer frightening. It was inevitable, perhaps welcome. He huddled in the corner, wrapped in layers of frozen cloth, waiting for the cold to take him. His fingers were black with frostbite. His feet had lost all feeling. His mind drifted between consciousness and hallucination, seeing his mother's kitchen in Bavaria, smelling bread that did not exist, hearing voices from years past. He did not hear the Soviet soldier enter the basement. Panikhin had also become separated from his platoon. The attack had fragmented in the confusion of smoke and ruins. He had pursued a group of Germans into this building, only to lose them in the maze of corridors. Now he was alone, moving through the basement carefully, his rifle ready, expecting ambush at every turn. When he saw the German soldier huddled in the corner, his first instinct was to shoot. But something stopped him. The German was not holding a weapon. He was not moving. He looked more like a corpse than a threat. Panikhin approached cautiously, his rifle aimed at the soldier's head, speaking in Russian. "Hands? Show hands." The German did not respond. Panikhin repeated the command in broken German. "Hand hoch." Still nothing. He prodded the soldier with his boot hard enough to get attention. Schmidt felt the kick and slowly raised his head. His eyes focused on the Soviet soldier standing over him, rifle pointed at his face. He should have felt fear. Instead he felt nothing. He raised his hands slowly, the movement painful, his frozen fingers barely responding. "Nicht schießen," he whispered. "Don't shoot." But his voice was so weak the words barely carried. He looked at the Soviet soldier and waited for death. Panikhin saw the German's face clearly for the first time. Young, perhaps 22 or 23. Skeletal. Eyes hollow with starvation and cold. This was not a soldier. This was a dying man. Panikhin lowered his rifle slightly, uncertain. Protocol said to shoot enemy combatants, to take no chances. But this man was no threat. He was already defeated, not by bullets but by Stalingrad itself. For several seconds they stared at each other. Two men. One Russian, one German. Enemies. Yet in that moment the categories seemed meaningless. They were both prisoners of the same ruins, victims of the same winter, survivors of the same hell. Panikhin made a decision that defied his training, his orders, everything he had been taught about the enemy. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and sat down against the opposite wall. Schmidt watched in confusion as the Soviet soldier sat, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small paper package. Panikhin unwrapped it carefully, revealing a portion of hard bread and a single cigarette. He broke the bread in half, extended one piece toward the German, and said in simple Russian, "Yesh." Schmidt stared at the offered bread, unable to process what was happening. The Soviet soldier gestured again, insistent. Slowly Schmidt reached out and took the bread. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. He brought it to his mouth and bit, the act of chewing almost painful after days without food. It was hard as stone, barely edible, but to him it tasted like life itself. Across from him, Panikhin ate his own portion in silence, watching the German consume the bread with desperate intensity. When the bread was gone, Panikhin lit the cigarette, took a single drag, then held it out to Schmidt. The German hesitated, then accepted it, his frozen fingers nearly dropping the precious thing. He inhaled deeply, the smoke harsh in his throat, the taste of tobacco overwhelming his senses. He took 2 more drags, then handed it back. They passed the cigarette between them in silence, sharing the last luxury either possessed, until it burned down to nothing. They did not speak. Language was unnecessary. They simply sat together in the frozen basement as snow fell outside, 2 enemies who had briefly stopped being enemies, who had recognized in each other something more fundamental than the uniforms they wore. For perhaps 10 minutes, they shared space and silence and the warmth of human presence in a world that had become inhuman. Then Panikhin stood. He gestured for Schmidt to remain where he was. The German nodded. Panikhin moved toward the stairs, paused at the doorway, looked back once, then disappeared into the ruins. Schmidt sat alone again, the taste of tobacco on his lips, the memory of bread in his stomach, and a confusion of emotions he could not name. He had been shown mercy by the enemy. He had been treated as human by someone who should have killed him. The war would continue. Panikhin would rejoin his unit and fight until Stalingrad fell. Schmidt would be captured 3 weeks later when the German 6th Army surrendered, beginning years of captivity in Soviet camps. They would never see each other again. They did not know each other's names. But in that frozen basement, they had shared something more important than names, a moment of humanity in the midst of horror, proof that even in Stalingrad compassion could survive. February 2, 1943. General Paulus surrendered the remainder of the German 6th Army. 91,000 soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. They were skeletal figures, barely able to walk, their faces haggard with starvation and frostbite. Of those 91,000, fewer than 6,000 would survive to return to Germany years later. The rest would die in captivity, in labor camps, in hospitals, victims of the same starvation and cold that had destroyed them in Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad had lasted 200 days. Casualty estimates varied, but the truth was staggering. The German 6th Army ceased to exist. Soviet losses exceeded 500,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Civilian casualties, impossible to calculate accurately, numbered in the tens of thousands. The city itself was obliterated, every building damaged or destroyed, the population that had numbered 400,000 reduced to fewer than 10,000 survivors hiding in cellars and ruins. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. Hitler's armies would never again advance with the confidence they had carried into Russia. The myth of German invincibility died in the ruins along with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Red Army, bloodied and brutalized, had proven it could not only resist but destroy the Wehrmacht's finest formation. The tide had turned. But for those who survived, the legacy was not strategic triumph or defeat. It was memory. Schmidt spent 4 years in Soviet prison camps before returning to Bavaria in 1947. He weighed less than 50 kilograms. He suffered from nightmares that never stopped, images of frozen corpses and starving men that haunted him until his death in 1989. He never spoke about Stalingrad to his family, never told his children what he had endured. The memories were too painful, too incomprehensible. He remembered the cigarette. The Soviet soldier who had spared his life and shared his ration. In his darkest moments, that memory was what sustained him, proof that humanity persisted even in hell. He never learned the Russian's name, never discovered what happened to him. But he carried the debt of that mercy until he died, a quiet weight that shaped how he treated others for the rest of his life. Panikhin survived the battle and fought westward with the Red Army until the war's end. He was wounded twice more, decorated for valor, promoted to captain. He returned to Leningrad in 1945, married, became a teacher again. But Stalingrad never left him. He dreamed of the ruins, the cold, the faces of men he had killed and men who had died beside him. He told his students about courage and sacrifice, but he did not tell them about the German soldier in the basement, the moment he had chosen mercy over duty. The ruins of Stalingrad were rebuilt into Volgograd, a monument to Soviet triumph. Memorials were erected. The battle was celebrated as a turning point, the moment when fascism began its retreat. But beneath the propaganda and the triumphalism lay the truth that survivors knew: Stalingrad had not been glorious. It had been hell. Both sides had suffered beyond comprehension. Both sides had lost something irreplaceable. Victory and defeat were abstractions that meant nothing to the men who had frozen and starved in the rubble. The cigarette shared in the basement is not recorded in any official history. No general's memoir mentions it. No medal commemorates it. Yet it was as real as the battles, as significant as the strategic maneuvers. It was proof that even in the worst circumstances humanity has created, even in total war, even in a city devoted entirely to killing, two enemies could recognize each other as human and act accordingly. The ruins of Stalingrad are gone now, replaced by a modern city. The generation that fought there has passed. The memorials remain, granite and bronze monuments to sacrifice and victory. But the ghosts linger. They walk the streets where they died. They whisper in the winter wind. They remember not the grand strategies and political purposes, but the cold, the hunger, the fear, and occasionally the brief moments when compassion survived the killing. The legacy of Stalingrad is not the strategic shift or the casualty figures. It is the knowledge that war destroys everyone it touches. That suffering does not distinguish between victor and vanquished. That in the end, the soldiers on both sides were victims of forces beyond their control, young men sent to kill each other for reasons they barely understood. And that even in such darkness, the spark of humanity could not be entirely extinguished. Two men shared a cigarette in a frozen basement. One Russian. One German. Enemies who briefly stopped being enemies. They showed that mercy was possible even when everything conspired to make it impossible. They proved that the choice to see the humanity in the enemy remained always even in hell. That cigarette, passed between frozen hands, was an act of rebellion against the war itself, a small victory of compassion over hatred. Stalingrad ended in February 1943. But its echoes continue. In every conflict where soldiers discover that the enemy suffers the same wounds, feels the same fear, wants the same things. Warmth, food, home, survival. In every moment when someone chooses mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. The ghosts of Stalingrad remind us that war's greatest casualty is not lives lost, but humanity surrendered. And that the greatest act of resistance is to preserve that humanity, even when the world demands we abandon it. The cigarette burned down to nothing decades ago. The men who shared it are gone. But the moment remains, a small light in the darkness, proof that even in Stalingrad, compassion could find a way.